Okay, BookTube, back for another video. This will be a review video, or a my thoughts video, not really a review, but I'll be discussing a book that I recently finished, and it is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this is the Penguin Classic edition with the older cover. The current Penguin Classics has a different cover now, but this is still the David Macduff translation. And so I'm going to be talking about my thoughts after reading this book. First, just a warning that this will be a spoiler-filled review or thoughts. I'm not actually reviewing it. I don't know why I keep saying review, but it's just my thoughts. I'm giving my thoughts, and I want to discuss the entire story, what I thought about it, and just whatever comes to mind as I discuss it. So, if you're not familiar with this novel, Crime and Punishment, this is the story of Raskolnikov, and basically his what happens in a certain period in his life. He is a former student in St. Petersburg in Russia, and he is in the lowest level of poverty. He does have a room that he rents, but it's extremely small. It's barely a room at all, and he is also quite taken with the current ideas of the day. So in Dostoevsky's Russia, there was this encroaching sense of ideas that were quite radical, like radical ideas, very nihilistic ideas, and ones that challenge conventional morality, traditional religion. And Dostoevsky himself was a very religious writer, at least more as he grew older. And this novel is basically him expounding on his reflections on these new ideas through the character of Raskolnikov and Raskolnikov's happenings in this novel. And the famous event in this novel, of course, happens right away. It's Raskolnikov actually murders an old woman, a pawnbroker that he has visited before. And the whole idea is that she is quite wealthy and she hoards her money, and Raskolnikov thinks that if he can murder her and take all her money and use it for good, it would help people like him who are in destitute or in poverty, and it would do a lot of benefit for the greater good. So it's essentially a utilitarian argument where you do the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. And that's what his thinking is there, though, of course, as the novel goes along, we get more and more behind why Raskolnikov committed this murder. And it turns out that he's quite taken up with his own theories. But before I go into that, so he commits this murder, and after this murder, then he's visited by his family. His family comes out from outside of the city where he himself grew up before he went to the city to get a university education. And it's about him coming to grips with not only his change in circumstances with his family, but also with his committed murder, his act, which he thought he could do in the most rational way possible, where there's even a point in this novel where he's making fun of all the previous criminals who were so clumsy in how they committed murders. Well, when he commits a crime, it's not going to be clumsy. But of course, as soon as he commits the murder, he's extremely clumsy. And I think it's his growing awareness of, or his not growing awareness, but his conflict with his own moral self, where he doesn't want to feel guilt. He doesn't want to be morally conflicted, and yet, against his own will, he is extremely disturbed by his own actions. And the whole novel is basically insanity in the lowest levels of society. So it's in the dirtiest, dungiest parts of St. Petersburg, and the characters all have their own twist to them, but Raskolnikov especially, they all have this, Raskolnikov and a few other of the poor lonely characters too, where they have these bouts of madness where they spout out and they rant, and they basically go show show they're not quite right in their mind, and it's a fascinating book. I remember so I have read this before. I read this when I was in high school in the Signet Classics translation. I don't recall the translator off the bat, but I know that it's got the distinct like red and black stripped cover where it's like there's a line right through in the middle there. It's a very distinct cover. If you look it up, you'll see. And I enjoyed that translation, though I don't remember anything distinctive about it other than I quite enjoyed the story. Like parts of the story have been sticking in my mind ever since I read this book in high school. But this time around, reading it for a second time, it really struck me how how crazy this novel is, but how elusive our main character is. So usually this novel is billed as a psychological thriller, and we're supposed to be able to like see into the mind of a killer, but I don't think that's quite accurate, because we don't really see into Raskolnikov's mind. We see his ramblings, and we get his, but we also get a lot of descriptions of his actions, and a lot of his ramblings conflict with his actions. So Raskolnikov is, and in the very beginning, of course, he's a very unlikable character, and he stays quite unlikable for the rest of the novel. But I found myself, at least, in a sense, almost rooting for him, rooting for the moral side of him, for the part of him that feels guilt, the part of him that's attracted by traditional or the traditions and the morality, even the religiosity of some of the characters around him. He's attracted by this almost against his, very much against his will, and he's fighting against it. I find it myself rooting for him in those moments. But what I mean when I say Raskolnikov is an elusive character is that Dostoevsky leaves a lot unsaid about his actions. So we get his ramblings where he's thinking about characters. He's very, very mean. He's very spiteful. He's very depressed. But when it comes to him wandering around St. Petersburg, which he does a lot because he's unemployed, and he will immediately do something very laudable, like very noble. For example, there's one scene where he's just wandering by himself. All of a sudden, he sees this teenage girl, sedated almost, and she's sitting on a public bench, and her clothes were hastily put on, and he immediately realizes what had happened to her, and he's concerned, especially since he sees a higher class society man eyeing her, and he knows, of course, what the intentions of this man are, and so he goes up to her to, of course, see if he can help her, but also he lashes out at this man, and they almost come to a fight before a policeman breaks it up. And then he gives some money to this policeman to take her home, or to find out where she lives, because he gets the immediate sense that, this is something that she doesn't usually do as a young woman, and that someone else had put on her clothes in some hasty fashion, and he knows that the scandal of what this would be for her family and the devastation it would be for her. And yet, almost immediately when he walks away from that scene, he's very angry with himself, like, why did I give my money away? But then that happens all the time throughout this novel, where every ounce of money that he gets his hands on, as very poor, as hungry, as ill as he is, and as rational as he thinks he is, he can't help but give his money away to people who need it. He's very charitable, and he does that with the funeral of one of the characters that he encounters. One of the famous scenes where he listens to the monologue of this drunken figure. Was it Marmeladov? And I found Marmeladov to be a very pitiful figure, when I first read this novel, I thought he was very sympathetic, but now I think he's just a grotesque figure. Like the way he gets off on the sympathy of others is quite grotesque. But even then, when later on when he ends up dying, or he throws himself in front of a carriage and he dies from his injuries. But before then, there's a whole scene of him being brought home and Raskolnikov basically taking charge of this whole thing, and then he gives the money that his mother had sent him through huge expense of her own, because she's not very wealthy at all, and she could have used that money. He just gives all his money away to pay for the funeral, and we even it's quite remarkable, the character of Raskolnikov. But there's all the thing. What I love most about this novel, though, is that as dark, as crazy, as destitute as it is, as soiling as there's this greasy film over everything. Everyone is sickly. Everyone is crazy in their own way, except for maybe his sister. Raskolnikov has a very sturdy, self-confident, and basically pillar of their family mentality, where she's the one who takes care of the mother. She's the one who's basically this one of the few voices of sanity in this novel. But despite all of the seediness of this novel, there's these moments of absolute beauty where real human emotions and experiences shine through almost in contrast of the circumstances that they're in. And the introduction of this novel, very much by Macduff, David Macduff, he himself points out, well, one of the things he points out is that your interpretation of this novel says a lot more about you than what it says about Dostoevsky, except for in a few obvious circumstances, of course. But because a lot of people like to tone down some of the things that Dostoevsky was trying to do in this novel, especially the Raskolnikov's redemption, and that's what the novel is his redemption. But there's these wonderful moments, there's this one moment right after that scene where I was saying, where he had been in the apartment with Marmeladov, and Marmeladov is dying from his injuries. His crazy wife, who's she's crazy, but almost driven crazy through her circumstances, because she grew up relatively high class, but because of her first husband died and left her and her children completely poor, she married this other man who offered his hand in marriage, and he cannot support her because who's Marmeladov. He can't support her because he drinks all his money away, and there's this moment when Raskolnikov just leaves the scene quietly, but then all of a sudden, right behind him comes the eldest little girl, and she asks him, will you come to the funeral? And he kneels down to her and starts asking her questions, do you pray often? And he says, yes, we pray every night. And he says, well, will you pray for me? And she looks at him, gives him a big hug, and she's like, I'll pray for you for all the time, every night. And then they embrace again, and then she even laughs a little, and then she goes back to her family, to her crazy situation, and he goes back to being his skeptical, rationalistic, very lonely, moody, destitute self. And it's this moment where he's an atheist, doesn't believe in God, he doesn't believe in morality, which later on comes into being, where he says one of the famous parts of this novel where he believes in this theory of the great man, where there's certain people in society who are not bound by the moral laws, or aren't bound by traditional morality because they're great. They need to transcend the bounds of morality in order to affect the greatness on society. People like Napoleon. And he takes Napoleon as basically his heroic figure. And so they can create suffering as long as that suffering is for some great purpose. And of course the great is always vague and ill-defined, but Raskolnikov murdered this woman this old woman in order to test out to see if he is a great man, because great men commit brutal acts without looking back at them, and they use those brutal acts as a catalyst for great things. And Raskolnikov, he's almost he's not just conflicted by his own sense of morality, but he's conflicted by the failure of his theory. The very guilt that haunts him is the proof that he is not a great man, in the sense that he theorizes, and and that's what he's going back and forth with throughout this entire novel. And we only get his impassioned, very ill monologues, but it's only through his actions and through, of course, the sayings of other people, the people who knew him. For example, when his friend, was it Razumikin, talks with his family, we get little bits and pieces. Like, how did Razumikin is a friend of his from university. They both were students together. So Razumikin tells his family, his mother and his sister, what he knew of him before he dropped out of university. And we also get his mother's account of what he was like when he was younger. And all of these different pieces of what people think of him from the outside versus how we see him portrayed through his monologues are all and then how he acts through his actions are all these different puzzles that we have to piece together, and before we can get we can come to understand Raskolnikov as the protagonist in this novel, because none of it is given away. It's not. I can see how people, when they read this, they're not attracted to it in any way. They don't see the appeal of why would I want to follow Raskolnikov. He's just this jerk. He pushes away his family. He pushes away everyone who cares for him, and he torments the people, and he even torments them. Like, he doesn't just push them away, he torments them by being spiteful, by being, Macduff here translates a lot Raskolnikov's ironic smile. So he's got this ironic, almost spiteful smile, and it's that he uses when he's being particularly disagreeable. But then going to the redemption in this novel, his redemption is through the figure of Sonia, who's Marmeladov's oldest daughter, who is basically the breadwinner of the family, because she prostitutes herself in order to pay for food, and basically keeps the family afloat as Marmeladov goes off and gets drunk. And it's not accidental that Dostoevsky chooses a prostitute as the object of redemption, because Raskolnikov sees in her something that strikes him very differently from what you would normally consider a prostitute. There's this moral purity to her, this religious aspect to her that appeals to him in a way that he doesn't quite understand. He thinks the two of them are of a kind. He's the one who killed himself when he killed that old woman. There's a line in it. He says, I killed myself when I killed that old woman, or when that old woman died, and it was the devil who actually killed her. And the whole idea behind that is that he was possessed by these ideas, by these the traditional ideas of his day. And the thing is, I guess I should say also with Raskolnikov, he's a man of action. He acts out ideas. So we have another character, I forget his name, but he is the character in that he's another radical figure in this novel, who stays with, was it Lazahin? The man that Dunya wants to marry, or Raskolnikov's sister hopes to marry. Though he's a very pathetic figure, he's almost a Mr. Collins in the way that Dostoevsky makes fun of him in this novel. But he's renting a room from a friend of his in the city, And this friend of his, he's got a long, complicated German or Russian name, sorry, and he espouses very much so like a lot of his progressive ideas, but he never acts upon them. And many times throughout the novel, he deliberately goes against those ideas and points out that he is going against them, but he still acts upon them. That he's going against them, but he's still going to go against them because that's just, you know, that's how he's going to act. Raskolnikov is different. He has these radical ideas. He's going to take action. Or he's got these moral ideas, these religious ideas that haunt him. He's going to take action, and his part of taking action is in his redemption, where we have the chasing down of him by was it Porphyry, the inspector who likes to play psychological games with him, with Raskolnikov, but they can't pin down, or Porphyry knows that Raskolnikov is the murderer, but he can't pin him down, and so he tries to play these psychological games with him to get him to either break or to ultimately get him to confess, and ultimately he gets him to confess, and but it's not Porphyry who does it, it's Sonia who does it, because Sonia is the voice of which Dostoevsky talks about the need for redemption, where he needs to be, in order for him to become alive again, in order for him to become human again, he needs to go through a process of redemption, and dealing or going through legitimate punishment. Basically, what's the term? I'm completely blanking at it. Purgatory. That's what I'm thinking. Like a purgatory. So he's getting his just dues through his actions of murdering someone. He goes through the punishment, which ends up being 8 years of servitude, of penal servitude, and after that, only then can he attempt to become a person again. And that's one of the themes throughout, near the end too. Raskolnikov wants to commit suicide. He doesn't say it outright, necessarily, though it's strongly hinted at certain times, especially when he witnesses an old woman jump off a bridge. But he's thinking about committing suicide, and that would be avoiding his punishment. That would be him running away. That would be a cowardly end. And his sister and Sonia all fear that he would commit suicide, but they all plead for him to choose life. Choose life. And choosing life means confessing and being redeemed. The biggest surprise for me, I would say, is the ending, which I loved. I loved this ending. The ending is controversial because there's an epilogue, and the epilogue I found was completely necessary, but a lot of people, or at least some people, like to argue that it's not, that it actually takes away, because the novel itself ends at a cliffhanger where Raskolnikov finally confesses, but the epilogue is basically this 1,000-foot view about all these characters and what happens to them. Like what happened, like his mother basically goes crazy, and she dies, and that's what we're told of her. His sister marries his best friend, and Sonia travels with him to where he is in penal servitude, and she visits him regularly. But the thing that surprised me the most was that after his confession, he doesn't actually, he's not redeemed yet. His confession was a first step in the right direction, but he doesn't think that he did anything wrong still, or at least he says so in parts of the epilogue. He doesn't think, he's annoyed with all these other prisoners because he doesn't belong here. He didn't commit an immoral act, and he regrets not having committed suicide. But it's only when this one moment, when he is supposed to be working, but he's taking a break, and he sits down because he's part of penal servitude, is that you're sent out of the city. So he's looking at the beautiful Russian scenery around him, and he, all of a sudden Sonia, who visits him regularly, she sits down beside him, and they basically share a moment together. And then in that moment, Raskolnikov breaks and he leaps down to her feet, kisses her feet, and he weeps. And in that moment, he is redeemed because he has finally given in to inner feeling, to what is Dostoevsky's solution to these rationalism, or the excessive seduction of amoral or nihilistic ideas. He gives into inner feeling, inner moral feeling, and to what Dostoevsky would consider like inherent religiosity. He gives into these feelings and also gives into his love for Sonia. And in that moment, Sonia finally is confirmed that Raskolnikov loves her, and they both see the next number of years of his penal servitude as a very short time indeed, because even though they're suffering, they get to suffer together. And to them, that makes it worth it. And that's what I love about this ending. They're both sick, they're both frail, they're both pale, and in this sickly atmosphere of Raskolnikov is a criminal, Sonia is a former prostitute, and yet they're sharing this moment of genuine human feeling, and to them that gives them hope for the future, and it gives them gives their lives meaning in a way that nothing else really could. And that's what I really enjoyed about this novel, because those moments are speckled throughout this novel. It's a rather thick novel. My edition here was, I think, 650 pages, but it's absolutely wonderful. I wasn't totally convinced in the first 100 or 150 so pages. It took me a bit to really see what Dostoevsky was doing, especially since it's been a while since I read this, but I was totally convinced at the end. And this is definitely one of my favorite novels. So I'm going to end it there, BookTube, and we'll see you next time.